Good afternoon, and welcome to our latest edition of our Diversity Saints series. I'm Jeffrey Burns. I'm the director of the Harp Center for Catholic Thought and Culture here at the University of San Diego. And welcome. We have a very exciting program today on Filipino and Vietnamese saints and martyrs. A few years ago, I was at a first mass for a young priest. I had taught him a course in immigration history, immigration in the Catholic Church. So at the Mass, he thanked me. He said, I want to thank you for teaching me about the immigrants. He said, but you talked about the Germans a long time, the Irish a long time, Polish a long time, Italian a long time, Vietnamese 5 minutes. And you could say the same thing about Filipinos. But today, we have a different way of looking at the church. The church is made up of many different voices and many different cultures. So today, we're going to look at the Filipino and the Vietnamese church. But we're delighted to have two wonderful speakers. We have Father Christopher Nguyen, S.J., from the University of California, San Diego Newman Center. He's the director there. And our second speaker will be Dr. Christian Santa Maria, who is the director of campus ministry here at the University of San Diego. So it just also gives you a visual of how the church is changing. In the old days, we would have had names like McGivern and White, but now we have Nguyen and Santa Maria. And so we welcome Father Nguyen.
Thank you. And I'm sure that if you live in Southern California or in the state of California, if you ask the priests who are, Vietnamese descendant, and you ask, what's your name, Father? Obviously, it's going to be a Nguyen, okay? And I will explain that why Nguyen is so common last name among the Vietnamese community and right now, and why we have so many Vietnamese priests, particularly in the West Coast. As you can see, if you think that, in the West Coast, we have so many Vietnamese priests, that means that a lot of Vietnamese must be Catholic. But no. If you look right here, this is the Catholic Church in Vietnam. It's the 5th largest Catholic population in Asia after the Philippines, India, China, and Indonesia. So, but of those, we have in Vietnam currently, they have about 6 to 7 million Catholic, which represent only 7% of the population. Okay? And you might say, if you are only 7% of the Catholic population in Vietnam, why we have so many priests, particularly in the United States? Well, the thing is that after the war of 1975, many Catholics escaped, and I will explain why they escaped, because of the persecution that has been going on for almost 4 centuries, okay? And because of that, the majority of the Vietnamese in the United States, I would say approximately 30% of Vietnamese in the United States are Catholic, compared to in Vietnam, which is only about 7%, okay? And because of that, therefore, you see a lot more vocations in the United States and a lot of Vietnamese priests. Currently in Vietnam, there are 26 dioceses with 3 archdioceses and approximately over 2,000 parishes with approximately 2,000, 3,000 priests, and then does not include seminarians and other religious. Okay? So, in order to understand the Catholic Church now in Vietnam, we have to go back. We have to go back of when the Vietnamese become Catholics. Okay? So the early period of Vietnamese Catholics, I would focus mostly on the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Okay? From 1528 to 1771, there were 3 families vying for power in Vietnam. It's between the Trinh families versus the Mac families in the north and central, and in South Vietnam is the Nguyen family. Okay, and these families, because of their political fighting to each other, at the beginning, when the missionaries come to Vietnam, they don't pay attention to the missionary. So during that time, missionary can come and trying to evangelize the people, okay? But the problem is that the Vietnamese language is so difficult. So when the Franciscan, the Dominicans, and the Augustinian, they come in the early 16th centuries, they trying to evangelize to the people of Vietnam, but they have very limited abilities and attraction to attract the Vietnamese to the Christian faith. Okay? So most of the evangelizations were in the north. Okay? The south was still very, very rural area at that time. But the thing is, as you can see, the first execution of the Christians was probably in the late 16th century. How do they know like this? Because it's only few execution, and it's only of the foreign missionaries. You can see like Louis de Fonseca and Guerre de Motte. And now how do I get all this information? They wrote down in the history books, okay, back then. So therefore, they keep the numbers of those who have been persecuted in the early church. It's not until the 17th centuries when the Jesuit Alexander de Rode, okay, a Jesuit came to Vietnam. Now, Alexander de Rode, you have to understand that he was a linguist, which means that he learned languages very fast. And he learned that Vietnamese, for him, it's very easy. And the thing is that because he was able to learn the language, therefore the evangelizations start to become very quickly. So as you can see, within 3 years, okay, within 3 years, a 5 years period, he has about 50,000 converts. Now you have 50,000 converts. What happened is that now the authority, the kings, stop paying attention. And so they are afraid of foreign influence. And that is when Alexander the Rode was kicked out of Vietnam. Okay? So he was only in Vietnam initially only for about 3 or 5 years. He got kicked out. And what did he do when he got kicked out of Vietnam? He went back to France. And then he taught the seminarian in France of how to learn Vietnamese. And under they call it the French missionary, okay? They are the main influence that come to Vietnam to evangelize. So the French missionaries, they are an organization made of priests and lay people at that time. They came to Vietnam and they start to spread. And Alexander Rode sneaked back into Vietnam again and trying to evangelize, got caught again, and was kicked out permanently. So the first wave is just maybe within maybe 100 Christians were being executed. And then the second wave of execution, this is when you can see with the date that now you have a larger number of people. And so therefore the persecutions is going to be increasing. But the problem is that at this time, Christianity in Vietnam is still relatively new. And so therefore the Jesuits coming to Vietnam, and again, they adapt the same method as they use in China, where they use the intellectuals of the missionary to entice the upper class, the kings and the queen and the court. And that's how there's a pause, almost 50 years in the 18th century when the emperor liked some of these missionaries. And the emperor make some of these missionaries as teachers to their kids, to to the court. And so therefore, it was pause for a moment. However, around in 1773, there is a rebellion in the north, in the south, by three Nguyen's brother. And they are the one who rebel against the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and they start united the country. Okay? But the thing is that these three brothers, they decided to divide each part of the north, the central, and the south Vietnam into different provinces that each of the brother will govern. Okay? Now, these brothers, they are Buddhists, but the thing is that, as you can see, it's 1773, okay? The three brothers have won, and they control, but the thing is that the Nguyen, even though they're Nguyen, there is another Nguyen, the Nguyen's lord, the previous dynasty, were fighting back against one of the brothers in the south. And now at this time, one of the foreign bishop, the French foreign bishop, Bishop Andre Bineux, he started to help the former Nguyen's emperor of South Vietnam to fight against the Nguyen's brother. And because of that, he won the country. Okay? That Nguyen become the they call it the King Yalong. Okay? From 1762 to 1820, he's governed and take away the thrones. He retained the throne from the Tay Son brothers, okay, by 1802. Now, the problem with this is that the king just tolerates in using the help of the Catholic Church through France to retain his power. However, there's a trust. And so therefore, even though he allowed religious, quote, religious freedom, he just tolerates them. Okay? And he using the French as a way to support and maintain his army, okay, and influence. But the thing is that at the time of his death, okay, the Catholics start to multiply. So instead of 50,000, 100 years before, it became 300,000 in Tonkin, which is the northern kingdom, and 60,000 in Cochinchina, which is the southern kingdom. And now the emperor is dead. His next son become the emperor. Now, the next son, he is, in some way, he is very dedicated to his mom, okay? Who was the concubine, the second wife of the first emperor. Now, she was a Buddhist, and under her influence, he started listening to her. And so then he would start to enact the interdictions of the Catholic religion and start condemning Christianity as heterodox doctrine. Okay? And so you can see now that the Catholic, at first, they tried to convince the Catholics to apostatize. One way to apostatize is that the soldier would come inside into the village, and they say that if you want to live, then you need to renounce your faith by stepping over the cross. And if you don't, then they will use different threats, increasing from fine to imprisonment to eventually execution. Okay? And so at the beginning, maybe people don't, and so they're using more force and more force and more force until people start to die from the executions and the imprisonment. Now, under the second emperor, Minman, okay, there was a Catholic general named Nguyen. Now, he was a Catholic, and so therefore, he defending the Christians. And so therefore, he trying to arrange it, and so therefore, the persecution was strong, but it's not as severe. And so when Nguyen died, his son Levan Khoi started to say, this is enough. And so what he did is that he got with the Catholics, they fight back the emperor. And because of that, Minman went berserk. And that's when the persecution, they start killing the Christians, okay? And so during that time, you have a lot more people are being persecuted. Okay? It wasn't until 1862 the the French start to using excuse because again, the influence of other countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, France began to sort of using excuse to put the soldiers in Vietnam to make it one of colony. Okay? And by this time, they conquer, they help, and they use the emperor now just become the puppet. Okay? But it was during this time, as you notice, from 1862 to 1882, is under the help of the French government. There's supposed to be more religious freedom, but the highest amount of people dying from the persecution is during this period. Okay? So let me give you the statistics so that you can see. I'm sorry, the next one. Okay, right there. The number of martyrs. From 1630 to 1700, about 100 martyrs. From 17 to 1800, about 238. When the French the bishops start to help the first emperor of South Vietnam, that's around 1800 to 1862, there's about 40,000 Christians who've been persecuted. And within 20 years, okay, when the French start to making Vietnam the colony, 60,000 Christians were persecuted. Now you are asking, why is it that when the friends come to dominate the country and the emperor just become a puppet, then why more Christians were being killed? Again, because then the hatreds, okay, instead of being even those in 1862 to 1886, the French, the soldiers in the colony, but a lot of people are Buddhists, they rebel. And so instead of doing the persecution before, they will burn the church, they would burn the village, okay, and so forth, and they will kill randomly. And so that's why the number of people who claim themselves to be Catholic are being killed a lot more. Because now it's not just about the authority. It's become, it's among the common people. Because then, particularly the politicals at that time, people would use excuse and say that if you are Catholic, then you are worshiping a foreign god. That's one. You are helping a foreign government to take over your native country. And because of that, you are a traitor to Vietnam. And so therefore, they will try to exterminate the Christian from Vietnam. and because of that, what happened is that you have Christian who either they live in ghettos because safety in number. So either you have a whole town of Christians or the whole village of Christians, okay, but not dispersing around. Okay? And when you do like that, what happened is that a whole town, the whole village could be killed. So it's a process of genocide, as you have heard even now in Africa, in Africa, in some other countries. It's a process of genocide based on faith. Let me go back here, okay? So the beatification process is gradual as well. Recently, right now, we have about 117 Vietnamese martyrs and Saint Nguyen, okay? You can see that it was it's added up over the 20 centuries. And let me show you the slide of who is Nguyen. He was more or less during the first emperor of Vietnam, Nguyen, okay, Nguyen Gia Long.
In 1995, St. Andrew Dong Lac was born to a poor pagan family in northern Vietnam. At the age of 12, he met a Christian catechist who provided him food and shelter. 3 years later, he was received into the Catholic Church. St. Andrew continued his studies in theology, Chinese, and Latin, and even became a catechist himself. On March 15, 1823, 1995, St. Andrew Dong Lac was born to a poor pagan family in northern Vietnam. At the age of 12, he met a Christian catechist who provided him food and shelter. 3 years later, he was received into the Catholic Church. St. Andrew continued his studies in theology, Chinese, and Latin, and even became a catechist himself. On March 15, 1823, he was ordained a priest and served as a great shepherd to his parishioners. St. Andrew was persecuted several times in his life because of his Catholic faith. And on December 21st, 1839, he was martyred. Between 1820 and 1862, over 116 people, including 8 bishops, 50 priests, and 59 lay Catholics, were martyred for their unwavering faith. On June 19, 1988, St. Andrew and his companions were canonized by St. John Paul II. St. Andrew Dong Lac and companions, pray for us.
Okay, and so that's just a brief on Nguyen Dung Lac, but you can see there are about approximately from 130,000 to 300 Christians die during the various persecution. Okay, so most of the martyrs that we have been beatified are mostly some are bishops, some are priests, and some are lay people. Some of these bishops, most of them are foreigners. Of the priests, about maybe 50-50. Some are native Vietnamese priests and some are foreign priests. And obviously, all the lay people are Vietnamese. Okay. Now, what happened is that in 1954, though for those who know the story, the histories, the French were kicked out of Vietnam because they lost the battle with the North Vietnamese communists. And so what happened is that the communists start to rule half of North Vietnam, and Southern Vietnam is a democratic country. As the communists took over, a lot of the Christians in the North are afraid because they know that they will be, most communists, they are atheists, and they start persecuting the Christian again, the Catholic particularly, because they say, if you're Catholic, you are working for a foreign country. And so that's what happened is that in the North, you have many people moving south, Catholics, and there's a mass exodus in 1954. My family, my parents, they were Catholic from the North, they moved south. They become refugees in their own country. They move south. Okay? And when they move south, they live again as if they were in the north, in Catholic ghettos. Some are in Saigon, some in other towns and villages. And so there, if you go down in Vietnam now, you will be surprised. Certainly, one whole district of in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, the capital of Vietnam now, you will see like one church after another church within a mile distance. And each of these churches, you would have like maybe 9 to 10 masses a day, okay, on Sunday, maybe 4 or 5 daily masses, and it's always packed with people. You say, where are all these Catholics? Because they live in the Catholic ghettos, okay? Now, the thing is that with South Vietnam is that there's still a lot of persecution. Because in 1960s, Nguyen became the first president of South Vietnam. And what happened is that he was a Catholic seminarian and he was trained in America. Now imagine you are a first president of South Vietnam and you happen to be a Catholic. You happen to be an ex-seminarian. Obviously, the population, particularly Buddhists, would not like. And so therefore, a lot of the communists will use all the people in South Vietnam, and so therefore, to work up, and he was assassinated. Okay? I know I've run out of time, but the thing is that when the communists took over in 1935, all Catholics, priests, seminarians were imprisoned or sent to re-education camp. And if you are a lay person and you happen to be Catholic, you also being sent to re-education camp. Okay? And one of the well-known Vietnamese cardinal, as you know, some of his book, Nguyen Văn Thuận, he was the bishop of South Vietnam at that time. He was imprisoned for many years in solitary confinement until he was released, and then he was called to Rome by John Paul II. He died, and right now he in the process of being canonization process as well. The present time, okay, the communists allow people to worship. They call it freedom of worship, but the thing is that it's still very tightly governed, just like in China. There are, at one period, there were underground church in Vietnam as well. Okay, and as currently, there's a lot of tensions between the two, between the Catholics and the government, particularly about the lands that the government have confiscated when they took over Vietnam. Okay. There's still no relationship between the Vatican and Vietnam at this time. The one that is right now, is still current on right now is the Pope Francis want to establish that relationship, but I think it takes some time for Vietnam to open relationship with the Vatican. So all the bishops from being installed by Pope Francis have to have the approval of the government first. Okay? Same thing with ordinations. The government have the stamp of approval. If, let's say, the seminarians are trained, but the government do not approve you to be a priest, then you cannot be ordained. I think I'm going to stop right here because I'm going over my time. So, okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. You can hear me well? You can hear me? Yes? Great. My name is Christian Santamaria. I'm the Director of University Ministry here at USD, and it's a great pleasure for me to share a little bit of my own reflections of St. Lorenzo de Manila, the patron saint of the Philippines. A couple things before I start my reflections today. One is I'm a Filipino-American, and much of the reflections today will come from that perspective. We'll hear a little bit about St. Lorenzo Ruiz's story, and maybe not just for us who might identify as Filipino-Americans, but for us as a church to consider what the implications are of this saint, what the implications of St. Lorenzo are to our life as Christians today. So in the suburbs of Los Angeles, tucked away in the San Gabriel Valley, is a small community of Walnut, California. What was once a town of walnut groves, equestrian trails, small farms, and even a vineyard for the San Antonio winery, is now a residential suburb with a Kohl's, about 30,000 people, and 13% of them identify as Filipino. And nestled in Walnut suburban streets is a palm tree-lined parking lot that leads to the St. Lorenzo Ruiz Catholic community. St. Lorenzo is an intercultural parish where many Filipino-Americans from Diamond Bar and West Covina and the surrounding communities call their spiritual home. St. Lorenzo Ruiz Parish is where many of the region's Filipinos come to worship, share life and recipes, set up tea times with friends, and sing in its historied Filipino choir. St. Lorenzo Ruiz Parish has special significance to me. It served as my home parish growing up in Walnut, California. My grandmother attended the church in its earliest years when a small group of Catholics, mostly Filipinos, would gather together in an empty business park. I was confirmed here. I was shaped by the food and the intermingling of Tagalog and English during Mass and after Mass, where pandesal filled with minced adobo were sold at very reasonable prices. I was involved in reenactments of the parish's patron, St. Lorenzo, through pageants that told of his story of faith, his need for refuge, and the circumstances of his martyrdom. For many Filipinos in the community, St. Lorenzo is a saint and a symbol who serves as a Filipino's access point to God through a familiar story akin to the struggles many Filipinos know as their own. Leaving family behind in hopes of a better life with no guarantees. Catholic devotion in times of extreme struggle. And a fidelity to God. A fidelity to God's commitment to God's people when suffering offers little escape. Through St. Lorenzo, whose story, almond-shaped eyes, and mestizo identity made the predominantly Eurocentric spiritual imagination effortlessly accessible to the predominantly Catholic country of the Philippines. Finally, the Filipinos have one of their own as a point of spiritual reference. Now, although my home parish of St. Lorenzo is undoubtedly unique to me, its cultural profile and expression are anything but specific to this parish in this suburban town of Walnut. Worldwide, according to the Commission of Filipinos Overseas, 10.2 million Filipinos work in countries other than their home country of the Philippines. In the United States, Filipinos make up the second largest population of Asian Americans. Millions of Filipinos have made their home away from home. Many take jobs in the service industry, home care, childcare, nursing, engineering. For all Filipino Americans, the experience of uprooting their lives, often for economic reasons, to find a new life for future generations is a story that continues to be lived countless times over. But for many Filipinos, St. Lorenzo's patronage is known as one that is equally cultural as it is religious. But his story, it evades many Filipino Americans and the church at large. In the moments before his execution, Lorenzo Ruiz, a Filipino man who fled the Philippines to Japan, was asked to renounce his faith lest lose his life. The story of Lorenzo has him saying in reply, "If I had 1,000 lives, I would give them all to the Lord. On September 29th, 1637, Lorenzo died at the hands of his captors. His death was the beginning of Lorenzo's road to sainthood and would take another 350 years to make him Saint Lorenzo Ruiz de Manila, the first saint of the Philippines and the patron saint of the Filipino people. So who was he? And more so, what significance does this saint from Asia's most Catholic identifying country have on the church and us today? In particular, what might his sainthood mean for the millions of Filipinos who are expats here in the US, and the generations of first and second generation Filipino-Americans whose understanding of their culture and their faith is seen through the lens of their new home country? So let's talk about it. Who was Saint Lorenzo? He was born in the capital city of the Philippines, in Manila. He was born of a Filipino mother and a Chinese father, therefore making him mestizo, or a person of mixed race. Lorenzo was active in the church, serving as an altar server, a sacristan, a calligrapher in his home parish. He grew up in the neighborhood of Manila called Binondo. It's the home of the world's oldest Chinatown. And as he grew, he joined the confraternity of the Holy Rosary under the Dominicans and developed a solid devotion to the Rosary. Often, St. Lorenzo is seen holding a rosary in religious art and iconography. He was married to his wife, Rosario, and they had 3 kids. The Ruiz family led a generally peaceful, religious, comfortable life. However, when working as a clerk in the Binondo church, Ruiz was falsely accused of killing a Spaniard. And so he sought asylum and went on board a ship with the help of 3 Dominican priests, Antonio Gonzalez, Guillermo Corter, and Miguel Arrozada. The missionaries were heading to Japan to evangelize despite the military dictatorship in Japan at the time. Missionaries and catechists were actively being persecuted and killed, but the Dominicans set sail nonetheless, offering St. Lorenzo Ruiz a spot on their vessel to aid him in his escape. So Ruiz accepted the offer, but he was only informed that the boat's final destination was Japan once it was too late to turn back. And so the Dominicans and St. Lorenzo at the time, arrived on the shores of what is known today as Okinawa, hoping to make it to Japan's mainland without being noticed. But unfortunately, the crew was indeed detected, persecuted, and detained for a year. The group was transported to Nagasaki, where they were waterboarded and tortured in unfathomable ways. Some of the companions were killed. Others renounced their faith in hope of being saved from further torment or death. St. Lorenzo, emboldened by his faith and fidelity to God, did not, and consequently, he and his companions were sentenced to death. They were hung upside down by their waists, and Ruiz died from blood loss and suffocation. His body was cremated and his ashes thrown into the sea. I am a Catholic wholeheartedly, and I accept death for God, Lorenzo said before his death. Had I had 1,000 lives, all of these I would offer to God. In the 1960s and 70s, the Spanish historian Fidel Villarroel, his historical investigation of St. Lorenzo at the Royal University of Santo Tomas, a Catholic research institution in Manila, was critical in offering the case for St. Lorenzo Ruiz's canonization. And during Pope John Paul's visit to the Philippines in 1987, Lorenzo received canonization alongside his Dominican companion. St. Lorenzo Ruiz de Manila is the first saint of the Philippines, since Catholicism became the country's dominant faith over 400 years ago. And this canonization happened 350 years after his actual death. His feast is celebrated on September 28th. So St. Lorenzo serves as the patron saint of the Filipino people, overseas workers, and the Filipino youth. He exemplified a fidelity to God through his faith, and many Filipinos remember him for his courage to remain faithful to God even in the face of death. So, in other words, he was a model disciple, never failing to give of himself even to death in the pursuit of Christ and the gospel. For many Filipinos, we feel we have a brother in Lorenzo who prays for all Filipino people from the heavens as we grapple with the reality of being a migrant, an overseas worker, a caretaker, when we're homesick, in search for a better life here on earth. Sugo sa langit, St. Lorenzo, pagdasalin mo kami. Messenger in the heaven, St. Lorenzo, pray for us. Today, over 10 million Filipinos have made their homes in countries other than the Philippines. So might St. Lorenzo's example of discipleship, or how might St. Lorenzo's example of discipleship shape the lives and faith of those who are now living and growing in drastically different conditions than their home country? As a Filipino-American myself who grew up in the LA suburbs, his story of torture and hardship is unfathomable to me and many of my Filipino friends who grew up in the States. The decision to leave family, to endure torture, and to be persecuted for living out our faith seems crazy against the backdrop of our upbringings here in the US. Even my parents speak of St. Lorenzo as a shocking story from the old country that's part of our culture. He's simply what we have, my dad said to me recently. For many Filipino expats who have established life outside of the Philippines, educated their kids abroad, and whose kids are now having kids, how is the patron saint of all Filipino people accessible to current and future generations of Filipinos around the world? And can St. Lorenzo be more than just a representative of Filipinos in the canon of saints in our church and be a witness to all of God's people? To mine the possibilities of St. Lorenzo's contemporary impact, the work of 20th century theologian Johann Baptist Metz and Metz's understanding of dangerous memories might be helpful. In today's American life, suffering is to be avoided by any means necessary in the pursuit of one's happiness and fulfillment. We minimize our own pain and suffering, guarding ourselves from the pain and suffering of others, particularly the poor, particularly the sick, and the outcast, so not to disturb our lives of predictability, of order, of comfort. Think of this. We can switch the channel when the news is too tragic and heartbreaking and order our lives in a way that can function without grappling with the reality of suffering around us. Metz writes, catastrophes are reported on the radio in between pieces of music, and the music continues to play, like audible passages of time that moves forward inextricably and cannot be held back for anything. Faith in this context can play a role of therapeutic deism, a feel-good experience that further shields us from the humanity that's happening around us. We become what Metz calls bourgeois Christian, a group of faithful privileged by default are on the right side of God's grace without ever having to consider the messiness of human suffering. The dangerous memory, then. The dangerous memory is remembering the whole story of humanity that includes experiences of pain, of trauma, of injustice, of mourning, and of death. The toil of the refugee, the mourner of the murdered loved one, or the hidden Christian who worships in fear of persecution. This all disrupts our perceived immunity to the challenging reality of what it means to be human. This dangerous memory can be challenging and threatening to the ordered life that has been fostered in its absence. It becomes really uncomfortable to celebrate Easter, for example, with its pastel eggs and chocolate bunnies, in light of the bloody torture of Jesus, the public lustfulness for violence that surrounded him, and the tears of mothers that preceded the day of resurrection just that Friday before. The same then goes for St. Lorenzo, whose story of asylum seeking, leaving family behind in hopes of a better life, landing in a foreign land and being persecuted, can be haunting, especially to established Filipinos whose patron saint reminds us of our shared past. For many first and second generation Filipino-Americans who grew up in the States, it is rare to find those who are knowledgeable of their ancestors' struggle to make a new life for themselves. I was 18 years old when my dad first told us that he immigrated illegally and undocumented. He hid from authorities and did what he could to find work and citizenship in our country. When I asked him why it took so long to tell me the story, he replied, "It's nothing we're proud of, but it is our story." Might St. Lorenzo, the patron saint of all Filipinos, help us remember how our own stories of uncertainty, fear, suffering, that these narratives are capable of holding something sacred, even if it disrupts the very narrative and life that has been built upon these forgotten stories of faithfulness in the midst of distress. It is only possible if we see Lorenzo's sainthood as not only one that recognizes his ethnicity as worthy of holiness, but his very life in all of its truth and its torment. Maybe then, such a spiritual practice would permit generations of old to share their stories with today's young Filipinos without shame, but with an understanding. The story of struggle and seeking a better home can indeed be a narrative of holiness. Maybe first and second generation Filipino-Americans might be given the permission to remember their own heritage, however complex, and see that they too are part of God's love and mercy through their connection with their ancestors. And maybe St. Lorenzo can serve as a reminder to us all that there continues to be many who are persecuted in our world today, who do not share the same ease we experience when we attend Mass or engage in prayer. St. Lorenzo's life and story is in and of itself a dangerous memory. It breaks down our tendency to shield ourselves from suffering and instead allow the suffering of others to be part of our lived consciousness and our call to be disciples of Christ. His example of discipleship reminds us that following Christ does not carry. He reminds us that the following of Christ in our lives does carry consequences, not all leading to death, of course, but it does challenge our assumptions that suffering is void of God's grace. The life of St. Lorenzo is one of a humble Filipino father who is deeply committed to his faith and seeks safety in the midst of persecution. His life and intercession continues to permeate the spiritual lives of Catholics around the world. In St. Lorenzo Ruiz, we not only have a saint who is Filipino, but a model disciple of Christ, who helps the church see the stories from our own lives we'd rather forget as stories that are capable of carrying the grace of God in their retelling. His life serves as a reminder to the church of our suffering, of our brothers and sisters who are suffering, who are often forgotten and overlooked, whose stories may be only uncovered by future generations who realize holiness that has been hidden for centuries. St. Lorenzo de Manila, pagdasalin mo kami. St. Lorenzo of Manila, pray for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Father Chris and Dr. Christian. So they are available for a few questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free. I would like to ask Father Chris to share his family story of coming to the United States. You talked about them going from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. But what about the trip to the United States?
Wow, that's a long story. You sure you want to listen? The thing is that my parents, when they moving from the north to the south, they were adults already. So therefore, they knew that when the communists took over, the first people that they're going to be persecuting would be the Catholics. And so therefore, at near the end of the war, um, my father was a high school teacher. And during the end of the war, a lot of refugees from the central area, they're moving further south to escape the communists. And he was just busy helping the refugees during that time because the school will convert it into refugee centers. During the day, school still going on because it's near the end, and near at night, that's when the refugees, they will stay overnight and sleep there. And so therefore, he never thought about escape. But the day before my town was being captured, my mom was telling him, you better find some way to escape because the town that was between the capital and my city was already being captured by the communists. And that's only about 40 miles away. And the thing is that my parents, they have at that time 10 kids. And of those 10 kids at that time, 8 of them are girls. And my parents, my mom particularly, know that if my father is being captured with the communists come over, he will be going to prison. And they will send us to re-education camp, or they call it new economic zone, which means they confiscate your house and then you kick you out of the house and send you into the jungle to live. Now imagine 8 girls with 2 little boys. How are they going to survive in the jungle? And so we just went to the harbor and looking for a boat. And it happens that my great aunt, she was rich and she had bought a big fishing boat and she invited everybody to go on her boat. And so that's what we did. And the next day we saw our city being bombed and we just went out into the ocean, just hoping going further south. And it was there that the American ships stopped picking up refugees, but we're not on it because there were just too many people. And a lot of them are Catholics because again, as I say, Catholics are the first one to run because they know they're being persecuted. And I remember because we have to jump boat. In order to reach American ship, you don't just, you have to jump from one boat to another to reach closer to the ship. And then from there, people pushing and shoving to climb up the ladder up to the big naval ship or jump onto the loading crane that they put down to the closest boat. So I was on a different boat that was not from my great aunt boat anymore. My mom's and some relative on a different boat. And the American ship, when they saw the chaos, when so many people pushing and shoving, they took off. So therefore, whoever on this boat, we're just trying to catch up. So the boat I was on was much smaller. I was luckily with my dad and most of my siblings. My mom was not on it. The only problem, the owner of the boat have taken the steering wheel with him when he jumped. So therefore, this boat has only half a barrel of water, and most of these are city folks, somebody have throw up into the barrel, so therefore it's not drinkable. And this boat was filled with people, mostly city folks, doctors, engineers, lawyers from my town. And there's no steering wheel. The boat just goes in circle. And I remember the feeling as I was sitting on that boat, and as there was a storm that was approaching in the horizon. And as I look around, I see suitcases, properties, people are just throwing into the oceans as they're trying to jump from one boat to another. And I was saying, maybe I'm going to die tonight because we have no way to get out of that circle. And there was a storm. And as I was looking back onto the windshield where the captain cabin was, I saw the picture of the Virgin Mary. You know, those icons, the Greek icons of Mary holding Theotokos, Mary holding baby Jesus. And I remember vividly, and I prayed to Mary and say the rosary. And that night, yes, there was a storm. We have been whipped around, and people on deck, we have to tie to each other on rope because the ocean waves are just pouring into, and you don't want to be washed over right in the middle of the ocean because you don't know where you can end, right? Luckily, the next day, the storm ended. But people are just tired because most of us, we never on the boat, never been, in the middle of the ocean, and there were sickness and all that. And so people just want to revolt and want to go back if they can. And luckily on the boat, we have one of the former soldiers, Navy SEAL perhaps. My dad, I remember my dad asked him to go jump down and tie the rudder. And that way you can steer the boat to go in one direction. And as we're doing that, we noticed that smaller boats by this time, the South Vietnamese president have surrendered. So therefore my dad said, I'm not going back. We're gonna push on. But we have no provision. So luckily there is a smaller boat with full people. These are people who escaped from the seaport where I was. They wanna go. But their boat was much smaller than our boat. And so therefore we exchange. People who want to go back on this boat go onto that boat, and we take their provision on this boat. And we go further south, and we were rescued by a damaged Vietnamese ship, a southern Vietnamese ship. I remember because the ship was not going straight; it's on the side, and you can see the big hole with water pushing in. And for me at that time, I was about 11 years old, so for me it was like an adventure. But I'm sure that my parents were really worried. And then from there, we went to the Philippines, and we were being rescued and sent to the processing center in the island of Guam. And that was about 2 weeks later, and that's where the first person, when we went down on the American ship, we saw the looking lost and found, and we found that it was from my mom, and she has posted that notice, a bulletin, for over a week. So she was rescued by some American ship on the night that we have jumped the boat. So our family united.
You have a quick question for Christian? I have a question for you, Christian. So one of the criticisms or concerns of Filipino Catholicism is its overemphasis or focus on the crucifixion. And so the sort of the penitential practices on Good Friday and that. And your focus was on more the suffering. So you want to comment on that at all? Sure.
What Jeffrey's talking about is in the Philippines, there's a hyper emphasis on suffering in popular religion. So you'll actually see people walking in the streets kind of whipping themselves. And there's a lot of critique about the integration of that practice and healthy spirituality. I would say this. I think if there is a shadow side of the Filipino people in the Philippines who have an overemphasis on suffering, we on the US side have an overemphasis on trying to avoid it. And so I think it's two sides of a similar coin. It's this. I think for Filipino people whose suffering is so palatable day in and day out, this kind of ritualizing of that actual suffering is cathartic, bordering in some cases maybe on health. I'm not an expert in this, so I can't speak too much of it. But I do think that the opposite is the case here in the U.S. We will avoid it so much so that we'll just avoid that people are actually suffering. We'll scroll off, we'll continue. I think that the Filipino-American experience and the Filipino experience in the Philippines might be able to liberate one another if we can remember a proper space for suffering, a proper space for remembering, and then a proper space for moving forward.
I think the church in Vietnam is still being persecuted in some way. And therefore, that memory has been ingrained within the Vietnamese community, even if it has been over 45 years since the loss of Vietnam. A lot of the young Vietnamese Americans have been brought up here. They might not experience that suffering, but they can see that in their parents, grandparents, and therefore that traditions of devoutness, of perseverance, despite the facts of perseverance in the faith, particularly when there's no persecution in the faith in America. And so therefore, will this trend of the next generation will carry that faithfulness, that devotion? I don't know. But at the same time, I do know that among the Vietnamese Americans, Catholics, there is an emphasis, not only the devotion, but on the growth of the spirituality. And so the next generation, even though they might not have experienced the persecution per se themselves, but their focus is more on a different angle on the relationship with Christ, particularly to the spirituality, to the spiritual nourishment in some way. And so that in some way it shifts the gear from being perseverant because of persecution to perseverant because out of the love and knowledge of God. So hopefully it's a different way.
Tough question to answer, but I'll try. First, vibrancy. Ever been to a Filipino party and had a bad time? No. We are a people, I think, of great joy. But I think there is a correlation to that access point of joy to our access point to suffering. I think there is, to Jeff's point, they're obviously open to criticism, but because Filipinos are understanding of hardship, I think concretely, it also influences how hard they experience joy and joy. So I think that would be, it's counter to an American cultural assumption that the closer I get to suffering, that means it leads to despair. I think that is the hopeful disposition of the Filipino.
Thank you very much once again to Father Christopher and Dr. Christian Santa Maria.